Before there were gods, there were the Anunnaki, beings of vast intelligence, born not from myth but from meticulous design. They shaped cities with thought, cultivated minds across generations, and bent life to match vision. But what does a civilization do when its deepest values begin to threaten its survival? This is the story of Methuselah, the child born at the apex of their greatness and the threshold of their undoing. His life did not begin with prophecy, but with precision. And yet in his birth echoed a silent truth, that even the most brilliant civilizations can collapse, not in flame, but in perfection. The Anunnaki lived in cities of quartz and resonance, structures grown more than built, humming faintly with stored intelligence. From a distance, their towers shimmered like vertical glaciers, monoliths etched with fractal patterns open to the sky. The land around them had been shaped by careful thought and long memory. Terraces curled like spirals into the hillsides. Irrigation channels followed golden ratios, and even the patterns of trees were not natural but cultivated over centuries to curve the winds around dwellings and amplify sound. Their society was not old by geological standards, but it was ancient in consciousness. The Anunnaki had, by their own account, awakened early, not as the first hominids, but as the first to decide what they wished to become. Their divergence from the Neanderthal cousins was quiet, not violent. They withdrew rather than competed. In glacial valleys and obsidian plateaus, they began a slow, meticulous selection, choosing among themselves the features they deemed most promising. And so, generation after generation, they chose minds over muscles, eyes over arms, cranium over canines. The result was a being of immense cerebral architecture, elongated skulls, thick neural sheaths, and an eerie silence about them. They spoke rarely, preferring symbol, scent, posture. Thought was currency, abstraction, religion. The heads of the Anunnaki grew. So did their dreams. Each generation bore children with wider foreheads, deeper ocular sockets, more complex frontal lobes. Their skulls required time to form. Infants remained fragile for long periods, and caretaking became an art and a duty. The wombs of their females, however, did not evolve at the same pace. Bones shifted over eons, but not with the speed of guided breeding. What changed in the skull in 10 generations would take thousands to echo in the pelvis. At first, this mismatch was manageable. Births were long and difficult, but not impossible. Medical knowledge, herbs, breathing, positioning was sufficient. Pain was revered, a rite of passage. But pain gradually grew into pathology. Stillbirths rose, not as anomalies, but as patterns. The records of birth priests grew thicker with each passing season. What had once been rare, a child too large to pass, became monthly, then weekly, then near daily. Among the Anunnaki, no one panicked. Panic was foreign to them, an emotional burst they had long since edited from their behavioral vocabulary. But the tension was in the data and in their own unspoken awareness. Temple vaults filled with birth records coded in bioluminescent thread showed clear arcs of degeneration. Complications outpaced interventions. Survival required ever more precision. Some of the high physicians proposed rebalancing the selection protocols. Choose for flexibility, reduce the head growth, slow the drive to cerebral expansion. But this was taboo. Intelligence was the axis on which their civilization turned. To choose anything less than maximum mind was to regress. Even to suggest it was to invite silence from one's peers, the cultural punishment most feared. And so the births grew harder. Women died with increasing regularity. Fetuses twisted in the womb and expired before first breath. The brightest minds of the age, paradoxically, came from the most fragile lines. Entire bloodlines vanished when their brilliant daughters could not survive childbirth. There were rumors, murmurs among the older class, those who remembered birth as a natural event, rather than a ceremony requiring a fully staffed temple. A few among them still carried within their bodies the capacity to give life without tools, without ritual. They spoke quietly of a time when sex led to pregnancy, and pregnancy led to birth, and births encouraged sex. But without births, pregnancy could become a death sentence. The younger generation's white robes spoke to their intention never to take the chance. In the house of birth, high atop the inner ring of Akkad, Enmara spent her days cataloging the metrics. A priestess entrusted with the balance of her species, she was the keeper of reproductive statistics, of gestational trajectories, of fetal anomaly logs. She was quiet, rarely seen, but her influence was wide. Her scribes brought her scrolls of data, not prayers. Her sanctum smelled of mineral antiseptics and myrrh. She had seen the trend curve long ago when she was still of breeding age herself. She had felt its chill then, a subtle slope downward, unremarkable to most, unmistakable to her. A culture that thought in millennia could still miss a generational collapse if it was veiled in technical triumph. Just because one could do a thing did not mean it should be done en masse, she had written in one of her sealed tablets. But the idea was dismissed, not refuted. Outside the city, their Neanderthal cousins still lived in tribal clusters, birthing their children in fields or huts, squatting under the moon, sometimes without midwives. The Anunnaki called this barbarism, not because it lacked precision, but because it entrusted life to uncertainty. But uncertainty had its own wisdom. It culled what could not survive. It ensured that what emerged into the world could live without being rescued. Inside Akkad, life was no longer born, it was extracted. And soon, even that process would no longer be elective. It would be the only way forward. The conception of Methuselah was not marked by omen or prophecy. It was logged like any other union high-caste partners. Optimal mental indices, desirable cranial measurements. But something in the way Lyri carried him, rigid, breathless, heavy, marked the threshold, though none yet saw it for what it was. The crisis had already begun. Methuselah would only bring it into form. The city of Akkad entered the season of alignment, when the three moons cast their shadows upon the stone terraces in perfect concentric spirals. In earlier generations, this celestial arrangement had been a time of fertility rites and blooming, but now it passed largely without notice. Fertility had become decoupled from moonlight and rhythm, from tide and touch. It was scheduled, managed, optimized. And yet, for all the precision and ceremony, more and more pregnancies ended not in birth but in stillness. Within the inner sanctum of the birthing complex, Queen Lyri lay encased in a chrysanthemum of cooling silks and mineral gels, her womb trembling beneath her like a tectonic plate. The structure was an engineered temple, where birth had once been a celebratory emergence. Now it was a dedicated healing chamber, every detail crafted with resonant purpose. Vibrations pulsed through the room, reinforcing the coherence of the mother's vital field. Geometric murals adorned the ceiling, sacred patterns meant to soothe the laboring mother with the reassurance of cosmic order. But the geometry of Lyri's body was no longer cooperative. It had ceased being functional in the old sense of the word. She had carried Methuselah for a full cycle beyond the standard gestational length, her body swelling well past the threshold of safety. Her abdomen was tight with strain, her skin stretched translucent. The infant within continued to grow, silent, unmoving but alive. He was already enormous. The biomonitors embedded in the bed's mineral structure showed fetal cranial measurements that approached the maximums of previous births. The child had not descended. He would not descend. He could not. The physicians stood in quiet clusters around her, whispering through gesture and blink code. They read the data. They made projections. They charted the probability of uterine rupture, of hypoxic collapse, of maternal death. All curves were converging on failure, and yet they waited, not from incompetence, but from reverence. Birth was still considered a passage, not merely a process. There remained an ancestral reluctance to cut unless nature had fully relinquished its claim. But nature had long ago gone quiet. The womb was no longer an initiator, it had become a container. It was not resisting birth out of hesitation. It simply no longer knew how. From a subterranean chamber below the sanctum, Enmara felt the vibrations in the data fibers streaming from Lyri's chamber. She did not need a minute to tell her what was happening. She had seen the pattern repeat, subtle at first, now brutally obvious. She understood the logic of prophecy, the trend lines that shaped its form, and this one had been rising steadily toward an asymptote of biological failure. She emerged in silence. Her robes were of bone-colored silk, embroidered with symbols of divinity, with glyphs of recursion and feedback. The priests of flesh parted before her as she entered the birthing room. No one spoke, and none needed to. Her presence meant that ceremony had ended. Now came the reckoning. The blades were brought, not steel or bronze, but obsidian volcanic glass, chosen for its molecular purity and its memory of fire. The instruments were as much symbolic as functional, for the Anunnaki did not forget the importance of ritual, even when performing the most clinical acts. The moment the blade touched Lyri's skin, a threshold would be crossed, not just medically, but species-wide. There had been cuts before, of course, surgeries, emergency extractions, but always as last resorts, isolated cases. This was different. This procedure had been inevitable. From the first moment of conception, no natural method could have delivered Methuselah. He was a product of their greatest aspirations, of generations of guided breeding, cranial selection, neural optimization. His skull alone, based on projection, would have shattered his mother's pelvis had it even attempted passage. The incision was clean. No screams were heard. Lyri had been deeply sedated, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. Her autonomic systems would have shut down otherwise. The womb opened like a forgotten chamber in an ancient tomb, and within, there lay the child. He was not monstrous. In fact, he was beautiful in the Anunnaki way. Massive head, high-arched cranium, serene expression in utero. Already his skin showed the iridescent hue of high myelin concentration. His fingers moved faintly as he was lifted free, suspended in the air between blood and breath. The moment of his emergence was not loud. It was not marked by crying. It was marked by the silence of a turning point. A child born not from nature, but entirely from intention. The attending initiates performed the sealing rites on Lyri's abdomen, but even as they closed her flesh, they knew she would never bear again. The uterine walls were thinned beyond repair. The trauma of this delivery had rendered her not merely sterile, but inert. Her body had been used not as a vessel, but as a scaffold. Enmara watched the child from a distance. She made no gesture of praise or celebration. She simply noted the moment internally, inscribing it onto the chronicle she carried in her thoughts. This was the birth that nature did not permit. It was not refused, just omitted. And we stepped in, not as guardians, but as usurpers. The child was taken to the incubation sanctum, where he would be monitored, nourished, tested. His name was inscribed as Methuselah, a name from the old language meaning he who lives long, though none could yet say whether it was blessing or burden. In the following weeks, a narrative began to form that this child was a miracle, a testament to Anunnaki superiority over limitation. The journals praised the precision of the operation, the brilliance of the birthing team, the strength of Lyri, who survived and returned to ceremonial life within days. But in the corridors of the temple vaults, the scribes wrote something quieter. They updated the breeding models. They recalculated pelvic encephalic ratios. By the end of the cycle, they recorded that 32.4% of births required extraction, and rising exponentially. The future had begun not with a cry, but with the soft whisper of obsidian through skin. The years following Methuselah's birth were marked by a period of subtle celebration and gentle forgetfulness. The records of the difficult labor, the urgency of the extraction, the cold necessity of surgical birth, they were archived, sanitized, and largely removed from communal consciousness. The Anunnaki were not a people prone to denial, but they had developed something more refined, strategic abstraction. If a crisis could be conceptualized, modeled, and formally bounded, it could be emotionally discarded. Thus, Methuselah became not a warning, but a symbol. His early development was flawless. His neural indexes surpassed historical maxima. At a mere 6 years of age, he authored a tract on recursive cognition that became foundational in planetary governance protocols. By 10, his sense fusion language was adopted for inner-court communication. He was prodigious in every way the Anunnaki revered, and yet the circumstances of his birth were never discussed. He was not alone for long. Within a generation, surgical births had become necessary for most lineages. Within 2, all. IVF protocols were embedded in civic infrastructure. The Anunnaki no longer gestated alone. Instead, conceptions were planned, genomes curated, and uterine development managed in symbiotic chambers monitored by priest technicians. The organic chaos of traditional pregnancy was seen as antiquated, even irresponsible. The very womb was reconceptualized, not a sacred gate, but a legacy device kept for symbolic lineage rather than functional necessity. Yet fertility continued its quiet retreat. The pelvic structure of Anunnaki women narrowed, not through disuse but through continued selection for traits incompatible with natural parturition. Muscular tone declined, hormonal cycles dimmed. Genetic drift favored neurological complexity over hormonal balance. And as their reproductive systems withered in silence, their bodies endured. To compensate for this slow erosion of new life, the Anunnaki turned, naturally, brilliantly, to life extension. At first it was mere maintenance, tissue regeneration, neural reinforcement, enzyme tuning, but then came somatic time suspension, cellular time dilation, identity-mapped replication. Lifespans stretched into centuries, then millennia. Methuselah, named in foresight, became the first to cross the 500-year threshold with no significant degradation of mental function, and each threshold after that. But he was not alone. Dozens, then hundreds of his generation joined him in what became known as the unbroken continuum, a cohort of elders who simply did not die. This was not immortality, but it was close enough to make the difference. The population, once driven by succession and renewal, became layered. The old did not pass, and the young could not come fast enough to replace the gap. With assisted birth, costly and slow, and with gestational technology becoming increasingly centralized and precarious, reproduction was rationed, not by law, but by availability. The priests of data reported with satisfaction that the population had stabilized. It hovered at a sustainable number, neither booming nor crashing. There was no famine, no war, no visible suffering. The Anunnaki had achieved something resembling equilibrium, but it was an illusion. Behind the curve of visible stability was the slow hollowing of vitality. Children were no longer born in enough number to sustain cultural refresh. Innovations became iterative, not generative. The elders, brilliant, wise, enduring, became the de facto stewards of knowledge, but their minds, however long-lived, remained anchored in the frameworks of centuries past. The living memory of society grew longer but shallower. No one noticed at first that language had stopped changing, that idioms no longer evolved, that myths had ceased their mutation. The Anunnaki did not stagnate, they crystallized. Each birth now required not only surgical expertise, but also infrastructure, nutrient pools, hormonal calibrators, neural environmental modulating fields. And all of this, unlike natural fertility, required power, precision, and materials. Where once every woman was a vessel, now each pregnancy was a project, and projects in time fail. In the 700th year of Methuselah's life, the house of incubation in the southern provinces collapsed under tectonic stress. 17 developing infants perished. A redundant facility existed, but its matrices were misaligned. The replacement births failed. The population dipped by a mere 0.02%, but for a people no longer growing, it was a gouge, not a scratch. Methuselah continued to observe. He had long since moved past grief. He felt something more abstract, the ache of impending obsolescence, for he saw all the records, not the public metrics of state fertility, but the deeper numbers: natural hormone decline, ovarian dormancy patterns, subtle neural retractions in the gamete-producing centers of the brain. What he saw was irreversible, not catastrophic, just final. There would be no collapse, no fire, no exodus, no war. The Anunnaki would not fall, they would not be conquered, they would simply cease, not from failure, from success, from the perfection of an idea too far removed from its source. Nature had been replaced, not violently, not maliciously, just thoroughly. And so the wombs closed, not by decree, but by disuse. The minds soared, while the bodies beneath them grew quiet. Life extended, but only backward. The future had become an echo, but even echoes resound. The meeting took place beneath the long shadow of the dying city, in the valley where stone once cracked open to birth fire. The towers of Akkad still stood, silent, polished by wind, their crystalline spires humming with residual memory. But no light pulsed within them. Their glow, once rhythmic with reproductive ritual and songless ceremony, had dimmed to static resonance. No infants had emerged in nearly a century. The chambers of artificial gestation had become mausoleums. Yet Methuselah remained. Not quite the last, but the last that mattered. He had sired many children, supervised their creation himself, tuned their gestation chambers, but Anunnaki methods always fell short of the responsiveness of a living womb. None had lived up to their potential. His mind was always clear, though his body had been reshaped a dozen times over, restructured through regenerative scaffolding and nanomaterial grafts. He was older than memory. He had not been young since before the moons last danced in conjunction. But his thoughts were not brittle. They had merely become geological, measured not in years, but in tectonic time. Across the valley came another figure, wrapped in desert cloth, body thick and vital. His features were broader, his skull smaller, his gait more rhythmic, his breath steamed in the dawn air. He was Melchizedek, leader of the sons of God, descendant of a breakaway lineage that had left Akkad centuries before his own birth, taking with them not only knowledge but a fragile hope that the species might survive, not by isolation but by fusion. The sons were the ones who had looked at the Anunnaki's dying wombs, their exhausted genes, their ossified traditions, and chosen risk. They had descended from the mountains and valleys of the Anunnaki and moved among the daughters of the Neanderthal tribes, learning their warmth, their crude languages, their wild fecundity, and birthed the Nephilim giants for their transgression. But later they found Homo sapiens, strange and verbal, chaotic and adaptable, full of song and impulse. The Anunnaki had once found them almost repulsive, their chattering disorganized, their thoughts unstructured. But the sons of God saw in them a pathway forward, not intellectually superior, but biologically viable and culturally fluid in a way the Anunnaki had long forgotten how to be. Now the two lineages, one ancient, polished and dying, the other hybrid, vital and emerging, stood face to face. There were no rituals, no ceremonial words. The Anunnaki had no language for endings, only for transitions. But Methuselah had prepared a final act, not for himself, but for the others who would come. He gestured to the valley floor where foundations had already been laid, massive stones, hewn with impossible precision, arranged in alignments that mirrored the stars as they had appeared before the Anunnaki were born. The pyramids would be their final offering, not as rulers, not as gods, but as ancestors. Not to be worshipped, but to be understood. The pyramids would be repositories of memory, monuments of humility, not declarations of supremacy. A way for the new people, your people, Melchizedek had said, to remember that knowledge, unchecked by balance, can become sterility. In those final days, the Anunnaki no longer tried to reproduce. They devoted their last energy not to sustaining life, but to encoding their knowledge for the future, gracefully and with purpose. They poured what remained of their science into construction, leveraging gravitational harmonics and lithoacoustic engineering. The stones were not mere blocks, but syllables in a language of continuity. Each one was tuned to the earth, to resonance frequencies long forgotten by modern ears. They would last beyond decay. They would be a message, not just a structure. In the silence that followed the construction, Methuselah sat at the apex stone, his legs crossed, eyes closed, not meditating, but remembering. He remembered the first birth, the first blade, the first cries that never came. He remembered the pride of endless mind, the ache of silent wombs, the still rooms where no child would ever stir again. He remembered Enmara's last gesture, a loop drawn in dust, the triad closed, a system complete, a species fulfilled and thus concluded. But in Melchizedek, he saw not conclusion. He saw continuity through divergence, a form of immortality the Anunnaki had never valued. Not endless life, but endless rebirth through others. As he placed the final quartz crystal in place within the capstone chamber, he could feel the pulses of resonance reverberating through his thoughts. Then he descended the stonework, now glimmering with solar tension, and did not return. Melchizedek walked among the finished pylons. He touched the faces of the stones. He did not fully understand their meaning, but he knew what they were, a gift and a warning. Later generations would call them the works of gods, but the sons of God would remember them as their fathers, brilliant, broken, and benevolent to the end. In 2022, the CDC reported that 32.4% of all births in the United States were delivered via cesarean section. This statistic marks a structural shift in how human reproduction now routinely bypasses natural processes once central to evolutionary regulation. But the more critical transformation is happening beneath the surface, the quiet normalization of assisted reproduction technologies, such as IVF, to overcome natural infertility. Historically, genetic variants that impaired fertility were quickly selected out of the gene pool. They simply couldn't reproduce. But today, IVF allows individuals with otherwise non-viable fertility profiles to have children at rates nearly equal to naturally fertile individuals. As a result, genes that would have disappeared are now being actively propagated. This changes the reproductive landscape from one governed by selection to one governed by support, creating a feedback loop. The more we rely on IVF, the more infertility spreads, and the more future generations will require assistance to reproduce at all. Unlike the Anunnaki, we are not selecting for intelligence or capability as we bypass these pressures. We are selecting nothing. Use of IVF for infertility does not reward adaptive traits. It neutralizes selection altogether. This means not only that infertility will spread, but that it will do so without compensating advantages, leading to an ever-growing dependency on technological intervention with no underlying improvement in the human condition. Just as in the Anunnaki myth, what begins as a miracle of compassion, making reproduction possible for those who couldn't otherwise conceive, quietly transforms into a species-wide dependency. The longer this continues unchecked, the more we risk becoming a population that cannot reproduce without machines, without ever having made the conscious choice to become that.